Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Sarah Zenaida Gould, and I'm the Executive Director of the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute. Tonight, we are joined by Dr. Kathleen DuVal. She is the author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning Native Nations, A Millennium in North America, and Independence Lost, Lives on the Edge of the American Revolution, as well as the U.S. history textbook, Give Me Liberty. She is a history professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She's also a Guggenheim Fellow and has won the Bancroft Prize and the Kundal History Prize. She has written for Atlantic Magazine, Time Magazine, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal. It is such a pleasure to have you with us tonight, Dr. DuVal.
Thank you. I'm so pleased to be here. I'm going to show some slides so we have some images.
Wonderful. And everybody in the chat, I'm going to put some information about how you can find this book, and please let us know where you're joining from tonight. So here we go.
So tonight I'm going to talk to you about a hero of the American Revolution. There's a statue of him in Washington, D.C. A portrait of him hangs in the halls of Congress. The sons of the American Revolution these days include descendants of troops that fought under him in the American Revolution. His name was Bernardo de Galvez, and he was a hero of the American Revolution, but also he was a Spanish general. He was no revolutionary himself. He was a man of empire through and through. And he fought against the British, like the revolutionaries, but he fought against the British on the borderlands of the Spanish and British empires, far away from Bunker Hill or Independence Hall. So let me start our story by taking you to April 12th, 1781. Spanish General Bernardo de Galvez was 34 years old. He was riding his horse through his military camp on the north shore of Pensacola Bay, in what's now Florida's Panhandle. In this same month, British General Charles Cornwallis was making his fateful decision, unwise decision as it turned out, to turn his army toward Virginia and ultimately to Yorktown, where he, Cornwallis, would be trapped and would surrender to George Washington. Galvez was in Pensacola Bay in 1781 to try to take a colony away from Britain and make it Spanish. So if you think about it, George Washington is trying to basically take colonies away from Britain and make them an independent United States. Bernardo de Galvez, as a Spanish general, is trying to take colonies away from Britain as well, but make them into part of the Spanish Empire. As Galvez surveyed his camp that day, rode around his camp that day, he could see his force. He had some 4,000 white and black soldiers from around the Spanish Empire, sailors and laborers. They were building fortifications. They were ferrying supplies from the ships to the camp, and they were setting up tents. Now, less than 2 miles away from his camp lay Galvez's targets, his military targets, the town of Pensacola, Florida, and the fortifications that guarded it. In 1781, and the reason why Galvez was going to attack Pensacola, in 1781, Pensacola was the capital of the British colony of West Florida. And if Galvez could take the capital, could take Pensacola, he would seize the entire British colony of West Florida for Spain. Now, let me step back for a moment, because often we talk about the 13 colonies at the time of the American Revolution, and that description really doesn't do justice to how many colonies there were. Of course, there were colonies all over the Americas, most of which were Spanish. And there weren't even only 13 British colonies. Britain, by the time of the American Revolution, had about 26 colonies in North America, from Canada to the Caribbean. What had happened, let's see, I'm actually on the wrong slide here. Where's my, this map. This map helps us see what the sort of geographical situation was at the time of the American Revolution, and why it is that Galvez finds himself attacking Pensacola from the Spanish colony of Louisiana. So if you look at this map, across the middle of it, you can see the French word Louisiane, and that's because this is a French map. And it was made before the French and Indian War, before the 7 Years' War. This map was made in 1757, so several decades before the American Revolution. It was colored later, though, and it's colored at the time period we're looking at, right before the American Revolution started. So when there was a French Louisiana, this whole middle of the North American continent, from kind of, at least according to the French, basically the Rio Grande in the west to the Appalachian Mountains in the east, is French Louisiana. Now, on the ground, it's mostly controlled by native nations. The French don't actually have all that many people there. But at least according to Europeans and their maps, that whole colony on both sides of the Mississippi River was French Louisiana. And Spain had Florida, basically kind of what's now the state of Florida, the peninsula of Florida, and then as far along the panhandle as Pensacola. That was all Spanish. Now, the 7 Years' War, also known as the French and Indian War, that completely threw things up in the air because France lost. France lost the French and Indian War. And in the sort of complicated diplomatic negotiations that happened at the end of the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, France gave the eastern half of that old colony of Louisiana to Britain, Britain being the victors in the war. And France gave the western half, what's yellow on that map, to Spain. So between the 7 Years' War, which ends in 1763, and the American Revolution, Spain has the colony of Louisiana. Also, because of the kind of crazy diplomacy that happens at the end of the war, Spain had to give up the colony of Florida to Britain. So the British, as the American Revolution begins, have all of that area in pink. Also that blue, what Georgia's a different color there, but basically, for our purposes here, what's most important is the pink part. Britain actually has that whole pink area, and it calls the western half of it West Florida. So basically from just east of the Mississippi River to Pensacola. They call that West Florida, and inland from there. And then they call the peninsula, where St. Augustine and a few other Spanish posts are, but now are British posts, they call that East Florida. Spain gets New Orleans as part of Louisiana. All right, so that sets the stage for this war that's going to come during the American Revolution between Britain and Spain. So by the time of the American Revolution, and particularly by 1781, when Galvez is about to attack Pensacola, he knows that if Spain could take West Florida, seize that whole colony, basically the eastern half of that pink part that's labeled Florida on the map, if Spain could take that away from Britain, it would particularly trouble Britain because West Florida was one of the British colonies that wasn't in rebellion against the crown. Frankly, losing Massachusetts, losing New England to the British shouldn't have been that big a deal. Those were money losers for the British crown. If Britain started losing colonies that weren't in rebellion, they might lose the Floridas, and more importantly, Britain might lose places like Jamaica and the Bahamas that actually were profitable to the British. Losing West Florida then in 1781 could raise the stakes for the British Empire in this revolution. Bernardo de Galvez himself had traveled by ship, horse, and foot over 4,000 miles from his home in the mountains of Andalusia in southern Spain. If he succeeded in taking Pensacola, he would secure his reputation as a brilliant military commander and also secure his future as a favorite of the Spanish crown. Now, of course, ambitious Spanish men had served the empire for nearly 3 centuries since Christopher Columbus returned in 1493 with glowing reports of the islands that he thought were in Asia, right? That had all been cleared up since then. But Galvez was following an old tradition. And yet, in the 1780s, Galvez was a new kind of colonial officer. He was a man of the Enlightenment. He was a philosopher. He believed that the future of the Spanish Empire lay in rational governance, in orderly governance, in scientific governance. And in the American Revolution, his fight was against Britain. Now, still, as I said, Galvez was no friend of revolution. He was not a Republican, right? He did not believe in republics. Galvez and his king joined the American Revolution for imperial reasons. One, to support France, their ally France, who had allied by this time with the rebelling British colonies. And second, to take advantage of British troubles in this rebellion. As the rebellious colonies fought a war against empire, Galvez led a Spanish war for empire, a war to win as much of the British Empire as he could for Spain. Now, it's important to recognize that to Spain and to France, as to most of the world, the American War for Independence was just one of many multiple theaters of operation in a much larger, almost global war among empires, a war that would be fought in Europe, in Minorca and Gibraltar on the southern tip of Spain. There even at one point during the American Revolution was a joint Spanish and French attempt to invade the British Isles themselves. They got thrown off course by a hurricane. The war would also be fought in the Caribbean, in India, and of course on the North American continent. From the beginning of the conflict, the American rebels tried to persuade Spanish King Carlos III to join them in their fight against King George III of England. Congress sent diplomats to Spain. They adopted the Spanish peso as the American currency and tied what they would ultimately call the dollar to the peso rather than to the pound. On the other hand, though, these rebellious colonists were hardly natural allies for King Carlos, right? He was Catholic, they were not, and he had his own American colonies to worry about. As a precedent, a revolution, a successful revolution, could be very troubling to a king. On the other hand, though, fighting the British was tempting. Although Spain had gained Louisiana in the 7 Years' War, Britain's gains in the war had been greater. Spain, as I said, had lost East Florida to Britain and certainly wanted to reverse Britain's gains in the East, in Canada, and the Caribbean. So even before the war itself broke out, Spanish Secretary of the Indies, José de Galvez, this is Bernardo's uncle, he's the Secretary of the Indies back in Spain. He sent spies to the British colonies to spy on both sides, to report back to Spain what was going on in this rebellion. One man he sent, for example, a man named Juan de Miralles. He posed as a Cuban merchant in Philadelphia, and he sent hundreds of reports on rebel activities before and during the war. Spain also sent troops to reinforce Louisiana and sent agents to recruit native allies inland, away from the Gulf Coast, from the Great Lakes to Louisiana to Florida, in case there was a war. And the Secretary of the Indies appointed his nephew, Bernardo de Galvez, to be governor of Louisiana. Almost immediately, almost from the moment he got to New Orleans, Governor Galvez started assisting the rebels. In spring of 1777, he sent the American commander at Fort Pitt, today at Pittsburgh, munitions worth some 70,000 pesos. He also sent him a letter saying, keep this secret because Spain is not at war with Britain yet. In 1778, the next year, France entered the war on the side of the American rebels, and France started to pressure Spanish King Carlos III to follow through on his alliance obligations to France and join the war effort against Britain. As an inducement, France promised that the war would return Gibraltar to Spain. England held on to Gibraltar. It was very irritating to the Spanish. And that the war would prevent Anglo-American settlers from expanding west and threatening Spanish territories. So in 1779, Spain officially entered the war against Britain. So Spain's war aims in North America were, first of all, keep Louisiana, and by extension, keep Texas and New Mexico and everything to the west and south. Regain East Florida, the peninsula of Florida, and take West Florida, most of which, not Pensacola, but all of the rest of which had been French before the 7 Years' War. To put it briefly, they wanted to make the Gulf a Spanish lake again, and then take land as far north between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River as possible. The Spanish king had become entirely convinced that his empire could expand at Britain's expense, and he wanted General Galvez in New Orleans to take quick action. The king wrote a letter to Galvez, or wrote a letter to the governor of Cuba, telling him to assist Galvez, as the king wrote in his letter, with whatever land and sea forces it is possible to assemble in those dominions. And the goal would be to attack Mobile, what today is Alabama, but then was part of British West Florida, attack Mobile and Pensacola, as the king put it, the keys to the Gulf of Mexico, and also to attack British posts along the Mississippi River. When the rebel Americans got the news, they were thrilled that Spain had joined the war. Thomas Jefferson, who recently had been elected governor of Virginia, wrote Bernardo de Galvez that Spain's declaration of war, as Jefferson wrote, has given us all the certainty of a happy issue to the present contest of which human events will admit. Thomas Jefferson cannot write a simple sentence, right? I'm sure Galvez enjoyed the floweriness of the prose once it was translated into Spanish. Late in 1779, Congress appointed John Jay to be minister to the Spanish court, and he sailed across the Atlantic eager to negotiate a treaty of alliance with Spain. So Spain had joined the war against Britain, but hadn't signed a treaty of alliance with the United States. However, when Jay got to Spain, he found that a treaty with the United States and respect for the United States was not what the Spanish king had in mind. To the Spanish crown, John Jay was just basically an unsophisticated emissary of a rebellion, not an actual minister from a real state. The Spanish crown didn't officially recognize him, and at first didn't even let him come to court. And I think that's an important reminder that Spain was fighting for its own imperial interests, not for this sort of upstart Congress, this upstart country, as it was declaring itself. Okay, so back in New Orleans, General Galvez had his orders to take West Florida. Now, West Florida and East Florida, these two fairly new colonies in the British Empire, they were heavily subsidized by the British. They had a sparse European population. Most of the people who lived in what they called West and East Florida were native. And they sent pretty sizable British garrisons there to hold those places, mostly against the British and the French. So the revolution itself, so to sort of explain why West Florida wasn't in rebellion against the crown, the revolution didn't really get going there. Congress invited West Florida and East Florida, along with the Caribbean colonies and the Canadian colonies, to join the revolution. But they really didn't have much reason to, and they were quite far away from the revolution. And then once the revolution broke out, loyalist British subjects began fleeing from the Carolinas and Georgia into West Florida and East Florida, telling sort of horror stories about these rebels and their tactics, and pushing those colonies even further from being interested in joining the rebellion. So, seizing West Florida for Spain does not look easy. It's firmly British. It wasn't clear that Galvez had enough regular army to attack and to take any of West Florida, or even maybe to defend Louisiana. Because at the very same time, the British commander of Pensacola, of West Florida, had exactly the reverse orders that Galvez did, orders to try to take Spanish Louisiana for Britain. So for Galvez, the loyalties of Louisiana's colonial population were far from clear. Most of them were not Spanish. Most of them were actually French. And some of them had rebelled against Spanish rule only a few years before in the New Orleans Rebellion of 1768, after the colony had been transferred from France to Spain. Now, the Spanish in the meantime had set up schools to teach young men in Louisiana Spanish, but most Louisianans still spoke Spanish poorly, if at all. And certainly they didn't identify themselves as Spanish. Just a few months earlier, Galvez had reported to his uncle that members of the New Orleans Cabildo, Louisiana's council, were claiming, as Galvez wrote, imaginary rights in the governance of Louisiana. He wrote, "This body composed of French individuals maintains a spirit of rebellion and hatred for the Spanish nation, which they cannot hide." Galvez wrote, "I've been trying to convert them for more than 2 years, but," he wrote, "without success." So now he's supposed to lead the militia of these French colonists into battle against the British on behalf of Spain. It's a difficult task. Galvez would need to persuade Louisiana's men and women, especially that French majority, that their hopes for prosperity and self-governance lay in Spanish rule and not in British rule. Galvez decided to keep the king's declaration of war a secret while he could work on building up motivation and loyalty. He started secretly to improve the city's defenses, New Orleans' defenses, to get some vessels for transporting troops to eventually make an attack. But he didn't tell people that's why he was doing it. Galvez invited Choctaws and Chickasaws and other Native American nations to New Orleans to get them either to fight on the side of the Spanish, or he assured them just staying home would also be fine and not supporting the British. He didn't want to have to fight the British and the very powerful Native nations that surrounded Louisiana and Florida. He knew he was going to need a strong militia. One of the things that Galvez discovered as he was starting this process was that most of New Orleans' upper-class Frenchmen declined to serve in the militia, as he wrote his uncle, because they do not want to serve in formations next to their own shoemakers and hairdressers. Right? They're too highfalutin to serve in the same militia companies as average people in New Orleans. So Galvez takes advantage of this. He established an elite cavalry order. He called it the Carabineros de la Louisiana. He gave them fancy uniforms with gilt buttons and gold thread buttonholes and matching sabers. And he worked on the other militias as well, keeping them separate, but encouraging them all in different ways. Galvez also increased the size of New Orleans' free black and mixed race militias and gave them fancy but different uniforms as well. He also created ties of patronage and friendship within Louisiana's colonial population, including he married the daughter of a prominent French New Orleans family, a woman named Marie-Félice de Saint-Maxent. In August of 1779, Galvez has gotten the news that the king has declared war, but he hasn't told anybody yet. And he addressed the inhabitants of New Orleans in the Place d'Armes in front of the Cabildo building. He announced that the mail had brought his appointment as brigadier general. And he said to accept the king's commission of him as brigadier general, he would need to take an oath to defend the province. But he said, "I'm not sure in good conscience I can do that." The crowd in the square murmured, "He's young, he's brave, he's a military man. How could he hesitate when the king calls him into service?" Galvez said, no, don't worry. I would shed the last drop of my blood in sacrifice for my sovereign. Where he balked, he said, was in swearing to defend Louisiana, given the unfortunate state of the colony with the few troops that I have. It would surely be a hollow oath, he told the crowd, unless the people of Louisiana promised me to help fulfill it. They took the bait. They showered him, as he wrote later, with effusive compliments. They assured him they were loyal. And he wrote, "They almost carried me in their arms into the Cabildo, forcing open the doors without waiting for the keys. Inside, they hailed me with the greatest acclamations of joy and promised me they would sacrifice their lives in service to the king and do the same with their property." So it worked. Galvez rode out of the city alongside his officers with his regulars and his militia behind him. They recruited more followers in the French and Native American communities north and west of New Orleans. And so by the time he was ready to make his first attack on British West Florida, Galvez had about 500 regular Spanish troops, plus about 20 light cavalry or so. He had 160 men of the small tribes on the lower Mississippi, including Homas, Sixtown, Choctaws, and Alabamas. He had a few British Americans who'd brought an American battle flag, and he had a large number of militia from New Orleans and surrounding areas. Once Galvez started to speak to the troops, his interpreters conveyed the startling news to all of these groups that he had kept secret. King Carlos had declared war on Britain, and he expected the people of Louisiana to do their part in this war. A roar of encouragement broke out, and the men followed Galvez as he lifted his saber and turned his horse toward their first target, the post of British Manchac. Manchac was just a tiny post. You can see there on the map on the border of that white space, which is British West Florida, and the sort of gray space, which is Spanish Louisiana. They took Manchac after quite light resistance. There weren't many people there to defend it because British commander Alexander Dixon had evacuated most of his force from Manchac and his artillery as well, and moved it 50 miles northwest to Baton Rouge. Now, Galvez knew that as soon as he took Manchac, it would be vulnerable to attack by water from British Mobile and Pensacola. So he sent ships to take control of Lake Pontchartrain, kind of cutting off Baton Rouge and all of that lower Mississippi area from reinforcement. Now, Dixon had made a good choice in choosing to take his stand at Baton Rouge. Spanish scouts who came back to Galvez reported that Baton Rouge was surrounded by a tall earthen fort with a ditch in front of it that was 18 feet wide and 9 feet deep. There was a stockade of sharpened vertical posts. Now, Galvez knew that he didn't have enough provisions for a long siege, but he didn't want to risk losing a large number of men in an assault, considering that, as he wrote his uncle, most of my small army was composed of inhabitants, and that any setback would cover the colony with mourning. The militia supported him now, but they and their families could easily change their minds if a lot of people started getting killed. Galvez wrote his uncle, I am certain of the militia's goodwill, but your excellency knows very well that one cannot count much on them, because as war is not their profession, they do not wage it with enthusiasm, and always have in mind, in view of the danger, the consideration of their families. So Galvez decides, considering his restraints, that he's going to use deception. It's pretty clear around Baton Rouge that the best place to establish batteries from which to fire on the fort is where the forest sort of came closest to the fort. And so he basically sent decoys there. After nightfall on September 20th, he sent a detachment of Alabamans and white and black militia and basically told them, look busy, sound busy. So they chopped some wood, they dug some random holes. A few of them occasionally would fire on the fort from the cover of the forest. Meanwhile, on the other side of the fort, enslaved laborers were digging real trenches. They built an earthen parapet to cover the trenches and mounted cannons. Now, during the night, the British in Baton Rouge's fort heard the hammering of nails into the platforms in the real place. They sort of realized their mistake. They moved the artillery around to that side of the fort and changed the direction of their firing, started firing on that. But the earthworks were done, and they sheltered the Spanish force there. And once day broke, Galvez ordered his artillery to start firing on the fort. They fired for 3.5 hours, and by then the Baton Rouge fort was in such bad shape that Dixon surrendered, and he also surrendered Natchez being completely cut off upriver. Following these victories in the early months of 1780, Galvez led his naval and land forces, including reinforcements from Havana, against the British fort at Mobile. The British had sent more troops to the Gulf by this point, mostly German soldiers and some loyalist troops from Pennsylvania and Maryland. But there were delays and confusions about whether Galvez was going to attack Mobile next or Pensacola next, so the troops were kind of spread out. And then there were several hundred Choctaws and Muskogee Creeks who came riding to the defense of West Florida, but didn't get there in time. Galvez's forces constructed batteries near the fort at Mobile and bombarded it until it surrendered on March 12, 1780. So Galvez's next target would be Pensacola, the capital of British West Florida. By the spring of 1781, he had more than 7,000 men amassed to attack Pensacola. Now, the British had been busy during the delay as well. They had reinforced the fort at Pensacola. They had laid in stores. But the commanding general there, John Campbell, had fewer soldiers than Galvez did, especially because he hadn't been as good at recruiting militia. And General Campbell knew that he would need Native American allies to have any hope of defending the fort against Spain. General Campbell expected that Native fighters would come to his assistance. He expected to have thousands of Chickasaw, Muskogee Creek, and Choctaw fighters on his side. But he didn't want to spend much money or effort on them. So Campbell, the British general, tried to make sure that no native fighters arrived until absolutely necessary, so that he wouldn't have to feed them and host them when they were in Pensacola. So several times there was a rumor that ships were coming, the Spanish were about to attack. Campbell would send messengers to call his native allies. The leaders there would assemble their warriors, start on the road to Pensacola, and then Campbell would send them another message saying it was a false alarm. And he would send them home. He would say, go home, rather than saying, come on to Pensacola, we'll have a feast, we'll talk military strategy, and maybe send them home with some gifts. So Spanish delays meant that there was a year between Mobile and Pensacola. So this sort of come, don't come happened, as I said, 3 times. The British Indian superintendent there in Pensacola was completely frustrated with General Campbell. He wrote, Campbell does not understand anything of Indians or their affairs. He thinks they are to be used like slaves or a people void of natural sense. At the same time, for these potential native allies of the British, the Spanish victories made fighting on the British side considerably less appealing. So as a result, only a few hundred Choctaws and a handful of Creeks and Chickasaws were in Pensacola to help when Galvez's fleet arrived in early March. All right, so picture with me. Galvez's fleet is approaching Pensacola Bay. The Spanish naval commander looks at the soundings for the bay. He says, the vessels are going to run aground. We cannot go over the sandbar at the narrow entrance to the bay. And in fact, there was a British fort there where it says Red Cliffs, and the battery on the other side that they believed would then just fire on the Spanish ships as they sat there like sitting ducks. Galvez was totally frustrated with this naval commander. And so one night he sent one of his trusted captains to take his own soundings. And the captain came back and said, I think we can make it. So on March 18th, Galvez himself led a Corsair brigantine ship into Pensacola's harbor through enemy fire from the batteries, shaming his naval officers into them also then following with their ships and gunboats. A 61-day siege followed. After some bloody fighting on both sides, the British commander raised the white flag and surrendered all of West Florida to the Spanish. Galvez next went to the Bahamas, took the Bahamas from Britain, so another non-rebelling colony seized for Spain, and was preparing for an attack on Jamaica, the most prosperous colony in the British Empire. In the meantime, the French fleet, which had helped somewhat at Pensacola, was able to sail to Yorktown and be part of the American and French victory at Yorktown. So Bernardo de Galvez was a major hero. Spanish King Carlos awarded him with a nobility title, the Conde de Galvez, the Count of Galvez. And in the commendation awarding him this title, the king wrote, to perpetuate in your posterity the memory of the heroic action in which you alone forced your entry into Pensacola Bay. You may put as a seal in your coat of arms the motto, Yo solo, right? I alone, he alone at the helm of that first ship. And in fact, you can see him on that actual coat of arms, solo there by himself on a ship, not to scale. So Spain won. Spain won its war against Britain as part of the Revolutionary War. By the end of the Revolution, Spain held the formerly British posts along the Gulf of Mexico and on the eastern bank of the Mississippi River. You can see in this map, this is not a map that the Americans will agree with, but on this map, all of that area in pink is claimed by the Spanish. And of course, everything to the west and south on the map are Spanish colonies as well. This map, colored the way the Spanish see the world at the end of the American Revolution, confines the United States to just that blue part on the Atlantic coast. In the eyes of Spanish officials, they had succeeded in their war for empire. Now, of course, as I said, others didn't agree with this map. Spain's claims included the very lands between the Appalachians and the Mississippi River that had sparked conflict between the British and the French back at the beginning of the 7 Years' War. Histories of the American Revolution and the early Republic tend to rush to make the map look like what the United States claimed at the end of the Revolution, which was considerably more, almost to the Mississippi River. But it's important to recognize that not everybody thought of it that way, and that Spain's claims were probably more likely to be fulfilled in 1783 than the United States were. And of course, most of this region had never been controlled by Europeans at all, but was in the hands of Creeks and Shawnees and scores of other powerful native nations. The ambitions of the United States did not look reasonable at the end of the American Revolution. The Continental Army's victory at Yorktown had come with massive assistance from European allies. The new nation was deeply in debt to the Spanish and the Dutch and the French. Under the Articles of Confederation, the Congress had very limited power to raise revenue because it couldn't tax income or property, it couldn't levy duties on imports or exports. Like the United Nations today, Congress could only ask its member states for money, which they had very little to give. Nobody even knew how big the national debt was at the end of the American Revolution because so much of it was still in the form of receipts, basically in people's pockets, people who had lent money to the American war effort. Shawnees from the Ohio Valley and Muskogee Creeks from what's now Alabama and Georgia were raiding western parts of the colonies from Pittsburgh to Augusta. And many, many Americans imagined sharing the continent with Spain. In 1778, Virginia Governor Patrick Henry assured Bernardo de Galvez that the United States, as Henry wrote, has much more land than can be settled for many ages to come. For a while, the Spanish and the native nations living near them saw potential for an alliance that would help both of their powers in the region and hem in the United States. The Spanish crown chose Galvez as the best man to implement this new vision. At the end of the war, the crown appointed him, in addition to being governor of Louisiana and the Floridas, appointed him Captain General of Cuba, and in 1785, Viceroy for all of New Spain. So he was based in Mexico City and in charge of a jurisdiction that stretched from southern Mexico up through Texas to the Canadian border, and from the west to east, from the Californias to Cuba. How to rule over an overstretched empire with few Spaniards living in it? Well, he figured he would just do it the same way he had won over Louisiana and won West Florida. First, alliances with native nations in places where they were the major population. Spanish officials made the point in treaties that they wrote with native nations in the region, including the Creeks and the Chickasaws and the Choctaws, that, as the Chickasaw Treaty put it, this land belongs to the Chickasaw Nation, although the Anglo-Americans consider it as belonging to them. In another example, the Spanish referred to the Ohio Valley as under the domination of the United States of America, but disputed by several Indian nations who were in reality the rightful owners of it. So make alliances with native nations and also win over local colonists with benign rule, with opportunities, with religious freedom. And for a while, the United States appreciated Spain's assistance. After the siege of Pensacola, Congress resolved to hang a portrait of Galvez in a place of honor in a room where the Congress met. They finally did that in 2014, so it took them a while to get around to it. Spain had joined this war to expand its empire, and it seemed to be working. To Spain, the American states were a little braggy, but weak and poor, as their continuing debts to Spain showed. Surely, the Spanish thought, we can keep them in their place as dependent neighbors. Now, of course, the map of the continental United States today so neatly spreads from east to west. It would be easy to imagine that people believed in 1783 that it was the country's manifest destiny to stretch from sea to shining sea. But both of those phrases, manifest destiny and sea to shining sea, those are concepts from later in the 19th century. If you think about it, Francis Scott Key's 1814 Star-Spangled Banner doesn't have any lines like that. He basically was just trying to hold on to Baltimore during the War of 1812. If you look at things from the perspective of the late 18th century and early 19th century, it was much, much more likely that a patchwork of European colonies and sovereign nations would be what would last in North America. There might be some Spanish colonies, British Canada, the 13 states, maybe as one United States, but maybe splitting apart. Multiple Indian nations, maybe a pan-Indian confederacy in the Ohio Valley and other places. Other newly independent colonies, maybe some free Black colonies, as there were sporadically under the Spanish or the British realm. Any worries that the Spanish monarchy had at the start of the war about the American Revolution being a threat to empires seemed disproven. Galvez's victories and success in inspiring loyalty among both French and British colonists seemed to promise a strong and continuing Spanish presence in North America. At the same time, to the south, Spanish troops had put down the Tupac Amaru and other rebellions in Spain's own empire. And in Europe, independent republics seemed to be a dying breed. The independent states of Geneva and Sweden and Poland and the Dutch and Venetian republics were proving too unstable to remain independent, much less republican, while parliamentary reform had failed in England and Ireland. Now, the Spanish couldn't see the future, but in the 1780s, to Bernardo de Galvez and others in the Spanish Empire, it seemed like a pretty good time to have an American empire. So I'll stop with that, and I can take questions if we have time. Ooh. I can't hear you.
My apologies, I was on mute. I want to thank you for that fascinating conversation. I was just thinking about how here, where we're based in Texas, Galvez is, of course, he has an island named after him, Galveston Island. And there are a number of people in Texas who consider themselves distant descendants of Galvez, and they're very proud of that.
Yes.
And then some years ago, he got a postage stamp here in the U.S. Yes. But beyond that, maybe in Texas and Louisiana, maybe we know about him, maybe in Florida, I'm not sure. But how fascinating that this person played such a big role in a couple of statues, and that's good.
That's right. There's a fairly new statue in Pensacola of him, a sort of a reinvigoration, I think, of public memory about him there. But I think one of the reasons sometimes it's hard for people to figure out how to think of him is that he was not a revolutionary at all, right? Even though he's on the American side, but he's really fighting for Spain, which of course he was.
Right. But so complicated in that you have these different countries that have their motivations to assist others for themselves, right? But that ends up helping the American revolutionaries in their battle against Britain. So how interesting. Of course, I think that one of the things that we have been trying to wrap our heads around at MACRI is, as the nation enters into this celebration of the 250th anniversary of the revolution and American independence, the founding of the nation, how do we try to think about that story and the promise of a country that's based on liberty and equality? And of course, we all know that they were talking about a particular class of people, but as the nation then expands westward, ultimately overtakes what had been Spanish territory, ultimately overtakes what had also been, in some cases, French territory and lots of Native American territory. Like, how do you think about, how do we celebrate this as a ocean to ocean nation when the revolution, it was broader than just the East Coast, but still, how do we wrap our heads around that?
Yeah, well, I think you did a really good job of it just right then, because it is complicated, right? It is not a simply celebratory history, right? The United States creates a country that is, in some ways, the contradiction at the heart of it explains a lot of it. It is founded as a republic where most free men have political rights, and feel that they should have economic opportunity brought by this republic that they have helped fight for and create. But because they are a nation of farmers, because they are growing very rapidly, the British colonies and then the United States, the population is doubling every generation, and they're farmers, and they think they've won more land than Spain thinks they've won, than Native nations thinks they won. That builds into this expansionism that then rolls over with violence. People in the West, Native people, Spanish speaking peoples, the long-term story it's a complicated one. And, part of the story is that those promises of rights then are something that other people have made claim to and become part of this country, even though most of us wouldn't have been included in its certainly its political rights at the beginning. And that's a proud story. The fighting to be included in the rhetorical and the somewhat limited promises of the United States at the beginning. But yeah, just as you say, it's not as simple. It's not as simple.
Yeah, and I just want to encourage folks, if you have a question, go ahead and stick it in the chat, and we will bring it up for while we've got our guest with us. I want to ask you, in terms of, so you've told us this story, which is in one of your books, but you've done several books also from this time period. Can you talk a little bit about the trajectory of where you have taken this work?
Yeah. My first book was my dissertation book, and it was about what today is Arkansas, and that's where I grew up, and I knew it had been at various points. It had been a French colony and a Spanish colony, and so I was really interested in what was going on there. And one of the things I learned as I read the documents about it was that it was a native place all through sort of what I thought was the colonial period. It is part of the vast interior of North America, which is not colonized by anybody, even though, as I showed on the map, it's claimed by different Europeans at different times. And so that, that made Native history more and more central to sort of how I saw early American history. And then I wrote this book about it's about the Gulf Coast in the American Revolution, basically, and the involvement of various Native nations and the Spanish and French people, French individuals, even though there's no French empire left there in the Revolution. And then my most recent book, as you mentioned, Sarah, is Native Nations, and it is a sort of sweeping 1,000-year history of Native nationhoods, the hundreds and hundreds of Native nations that have been and still are in North America, mostly in what's now the United States.
Yeah, I'm so interested in that your first project was a look at Arkansas, and I understand that you were looking into your own geographic history, but having done a couple of drives through Arkansas, I've always been interested at how many different places do have Spanish names. And I think it's easy to forget how big the Spanish Empire was at one point.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, it really, at the end of the Revolution, it stretches from the Great Lakes basically to, Tierra del Fuego, right? It's a big place.
And what's also interesting, which is outside of your time period, but these days, there is a significant Latino population in Arkansas that's more recent, 1 or 2 generations old.
Right.
And I think last time I was in Little Rock, I saw a Spanish language newspaper, multiple like supermercados.
Right. It's almost like there was this blip in the middle when it wasn't Spanish, and it is again.
Right. Well, I also want to just acknowledge that we have guests tonight joining us from New Mexico, El Paso, San Antonio. So welcome, everybody. And again, if you do have a question, you can go ahead and put it in the chat. Let's see. What's next for you?
Well, I'm working on a book actually about Yorktown. I've decided to go sort of back to the middle, the sort of heart of the American Revolution, to Virginia, but to try to take some of the the storytelling ways that I've developed in my other books to that, and really tell a multi-perspectival story of English and French and Native and African descended involvement in the sort of that part of the war.
Fascinating. Great. People are a little quiet tonight. Okay.
That's okay. That's okay.
That's okay. That's okay. Well, tell me this, in terms of the American Revolution, if there were one thing you think that some of these groups of folks who are sort of involved but not but on the edges of, do you think that there are things that I mean, for Galvez, for example, many successes, but do you think that in hindsight, knowing now, that the Spanish would lose that empire? I mean, would they have continued to see themselves as having some potential economic ally situation, or would they have been like, you know what, this is not. But I mean, the other thing I guess I would just ask is, we know that the Spanish Empire was having its own challenges, so maybe they didn't have any choices.
Right. Yeah, so much. So, as I mentioned, Spain makes these treaties with the Chickasaws and the Choctaws and other Native nations after the Revolution, and they're amazing to read because they are so different from what the United States was doing at the time. That the way they talk about native land being sovereign, I think, is like this path not taken, right? And I don't want to say, they did it all because they were just, moral or something. There was a real strategic choice to have strong alliances with these large and militarily powerful at the time Native nations. But you can kind of imagine a strong Spanish empire where officials realize they're spread out too thin, right? But what they can be is the kind of empire that is supportive of and works with Native nations, in contrast to the United States and to the British for the most part. But yeah, then other history takes over. There are rebellions that break out again in other parts of the Spanish Empire. Napoleon comes to power in France and pretty much takes over the Spanish crown. And so yeah, history's happening other places that keep all that from coming to fruition. But I think it's just so important to remember that the American Revolution was an international war. It wasn't just rebels within the British Empire. There's European empires like Spain, but also Native nations that are sovereign, independent nations at the time. So international in multiple ways. And I think that can help break down sort of thinking of the American Revolution as inevitable. It's like, of course it was going to happen this way. Of course it was going to take, of course the United States was going to span across the whole continent.
We do have a question here about Galvez's death. Do you know what led to him dying?
Yes. So, he's at the top of his career, right? He goes as viceroy to Mexico City. He and his wife, his French wife that I mentioned before, they are very popular. They ride around in an open carriage. They really, while I said he's absolutely not a Republican, a small R, he's not a Republican, he's not a revolutionary. He is a reformer, and he has a huge amount of support in Mexico City. And then he rather suddenly dies. And there are all kinds of ways that people can suddenly die in the late 18th century. It doesn't have to be mysterious. And yet there were rumors that one of the rumors was that maybe somebody in the empire had somebody in the a supporter of the empire had actually poisoned him because they thought he was going to lead a revolution. Yeah, so I'm glad somebody asked about that.
Okay. Well, we're just about out of time, and so if you're going to sneak in a question, sneak it in now. Otherwise, I'm going to thank Dr. DuVal for joining us tonight and helping us understand another side of the American Revolution that included the Spanish perspective and the Indigenous perspective. There's still so much for us to unpack about this, and we will continue to have these America 250 talks through the rest of the year. We also have other programming. I just want to share that tomorrow night we'll be in Austin, Texas for an event. We're wrapping up Latina Spring, our annual film series of independent films made by Latina filmmakers. So we'll be at the Austin Film Society Cinema at 7:00 tomorrow night, and we'll be doing a series of shorts by Latina filmmakers from France, Mexico, Peru, and the United States. That'll be a lot of fun. And for those of you who watch us online, our next online talk is on April the 29th with Dr. Lidia Otero, who will be talking with us about her new book, Storied Property, Maria Cordova's Casa, which is a really fascinating look at the kinds of the opportunities and shortfalls sometimes when we do historic preservation projects of homes in minority communities. So it's a really fascinating story about this property in Tucson. So we'll be joined by her at the end of the month. We've always got something going on. Check out our website, somosmacri.org. And let me just double check. Yes, okay. People are saying they're looking forward to reading your books.
Oh, great.
Thank you. Very interesting. I'm telling you, people down here love Bernardo Galvez.
Wonderful.
Any other suggestions for books about this time period?
There's a
Go ahead.
Yeah, there's a really good biography of Bernardo de Galvez by Gonzalo Quintero Saravea. And I think Bernardo de Galvez is the first part of the title, so that should be easy to find. Yeah.
Okay, we'll find that and share it in the chat. Okay.
Great.
Thank you so much. Have a great night, everybody. We hope to see you at a future MACRI event. Take care.
Good night.